Hello, good evening, and welcome to tonight's bibliotherapy session live, which is all about long-term love in literature. I wonder if you have any favourite books in which long-term lovers stay together over many decades. That's what I'm hoping to talk about this evening. And I'd love to hear if you have any amazing novels or pieces of fiction in which there are long term loves which inspire you and make you think of applying their methods of staying together to your own relationship. Before I get started on this lovely topic, I'm going to share with you a couple of the books that I've talked about on previous evenings while we wait for other people to join us. Because there's always a few books that I mention which I don't necessarily have to hand. One of the ones that I've mentioned on a session that was all about parties was this book, A Curious Invitation, written by Suzette Reed, Suzette Field, which is a really gorgeous collection of essays about different parties in literature from different novels. So we've got Mansfield Park, we've got Finnegan's Wake, we've got Great Gatsby, and many more. There's about 20 parties which are all discussed in this book. And it's a really lovely read and a great one to get hold of if you're missing parties, which frankly many of us are. Hi, Colleen, great to have you here this evening. And hi, Sylvie, it's lovely to see you. Another book that I mentioned last week and didn't have to hand, but now it's arrived, is India Knight's The Dirty Bits for Girls, which is her collection of all the places in novels that she used to go to with all her friends in boarding school, which were literally the dirty bits from novels. So there's excerpts from D.H. Lawrence, Rosalind Erskine, Georgette Heyer, Jilly Cooper, of course, Pauline Rayage, Kathleen Windsor, Judy Blume. So this is a great book to have at your bedside and have a look at every now and then. And it's only just arrived in my household, and I'm going to be dipping into that. So tonight we're going to be talking about long-term love in literature, and it's actually a topic which I quite often talk to people about in bibliotherapy sessions if they are in long-term relationships. And books can be a great source of inspiration for people to find ways of looking at their own long-term relationships in a more positive light. Because let's face it, every long-term relationship has its ups and downs. And the longer you are together, the more ups and downs there might be to be had. So one of the books that I very frequently talk about with bibliotherapy clients as a kind of inspiration is The Enchanted April by Elizabeth von Arnhem, which is a really gorgeous book, very inspiring about long-term relationships. But really, it's great because it's funny, uplifting, surprising, and altogether a bit of a joy of a read. And I'm just going to read you a little bit about it from the book that I wrote with Susan Elderkin, the novel Cure, in which you can look up any ailment and find a cure for that ailment in the form of a novel. That's the novel Cure. And the ailment that the Enchanted April is the cure for, believe it or not, is being married. Being married? An ailment? If that was your first thought when you happened upon this entry, don't read on. You've won life's biggest lottery and found yourself a mate you can live with effortlessly, peaceably, and productively. Congratulations. If, on the other hand, you find that marriage sometimes involves a struggle to maintain your sense of self in the face of constant compromise, if you feel your marriage is stuck in a rut, or if the passing of the years has somehow served to push you and your spouse apart rather than bringing you closer, take a burst of luminous inspiration from The Enchanted April by Elizabeth von Arnhem. A neglected period piece from the 1930s, the novel tells the story of Mrs. Wilkins and Mrs. Arbuthnot, two married women who have become jaded and faded by their broken relationships. Both happen to spot the same advertisement in the Times. To those who appreciate wisteria and sunshine, it reads, small medieval Italian castle on the shores of the Mediterranean to be let furnished for the month of April. Necessary servants remain. Who could resist an advert like that, I ask you? It calls to them both, and in a desperate bid for a gasp of happiness, the two women, though strangers, decide to take the castle together. They invite along a couple of feistier examples of their sex, who yet have relationship issues of their own. The impossibly proper Mrs. Fisher and the ethereally beautiful Lady Caroline, who is so sick of drooling attention from both men and women that she's become liberal with the icy put-downs. Within the purity of San Salvatore's bare white walls and stone floors, the women recover and slowly begin to rediscover their sensuality and capacity for joy. With the help of juicy oranges, meadows of spring flowers, and the ever-helpful gardener Domenico, alchemical transformations occur. Faces puckered by fear and worry smooth out. Hearts and minds that have been closed for years break open like buds in full sun. Love floods back in. I was a stingy beast at home, declares Lottie, Mrs. Wilkins, and used to measure and count. I wouldn't love Mellish unless he loved me back, exactly as much. Absolute fairness. Did you ever? And so he didn't, neither did I. And the aridity of that house. The aridity. We expect the women to find only themselves in their splendid isolation, but they end up, well, let's just say that their husbands don't get forgotten. Marriages are saved and great loves are reignited. If your marriage isn't what you hoped it could be, buy The Enchanted April, then book a villa in Italy and read it on the journey out. Sorry to say that, taunting you with ideas of booking a villa in Italy. Wouldn't we all love to do that right now? But you never know, we might be able to one day. Lovely to see you here, Sasha and Kate, who's saying that she loved The Enchanted April. I so agree, it's such a gorgeous book and it really is an uplifting breeze of a read, and I thoroughly recommend it to everyone, whether you're in a relationship or not. But it's definitely a book that gives you a lot of hope and positivity. Another book that I frequently recommend to couples who might want a bit of a inspiration for long-term love is the famous Jitterbug Perfume by Tom Robbins. Regulars of these evenings will know that I do love this book and very frequently recommend it for many ailments. But one of the wonderful things about the book, probably the most wonderful thing, is the relationship between Alabar and Kudra, which lasts for several hundred years. And I won't go into detail about this book this evening because I have talked about it on many another session, but it is a really lovely, gorgeous, uplifting, positive book in which there is a romance between the king, Alabar, who manages to find a secret to longevity that exceeds several hundred years, and the love of his life, Kudra. And their love is one that crosses continents and time. And it does have its ups and downs. It's by no means pure romance. but it's another one that really helps you to believe in the possibility of love lasting for not just decades, but even hundreds of years. Another book which inspires me a lot, and which I point to people who are looking for hope and inspiration for long-term love, is, well, of course, all the books of Tove Jansson. You all know that I love the Moomins with great passion, but Tove Jansson herself is someone who was lucky enough to have a very successful long-term relationship with her lifelong partner, Tuliki Pitela, or Tuti as she was known. Tove Jansson did have relationships with men in her earlier life, and she met Tuti in 1956, and they became lifelong partners by building a house on a tiny uninhabited island in the Gulf of Finland, about 100 kilometers south of Helsinki, where they could escape the summer months. And one of the keys to their success was that they were able to spend time apart, which, as long-term couples will know, is a rather excellent thing to do in order to give your relationship space to breathe. And they actually lived in separate apartments at either end of a block of flats, which is a pretty excellent idea, I must say. And I'm sure that many a long together couple might wish they could do that, or indeed try to do it themselves, keeping the romance alive. But they, Tove Jansson did bring many stories about her and Tuti into her novels and short stories. There are characters in the Moomins who are almost certainly based on the two of them. There's a character called Tutiki, who people tend to think is probably based on Tuti, Tove Jansson's long-term love. And also in their short stories, in the short stories of Tove Jansson, she very frequently talks about her relationship with her long-term partner. So they are incredibly inspiring, both as a couple and in literature. Hi, Seniz. Lovely to see you joining me from Turkey. Thanks for coming this evening. And it's lovely to think that my talk is like a bedtime story. And there's going to be lots of lovely readings and more discussions about love stories as we go along. So before I go into depth about some of these books, there's one I want to mention, which is a book that I haven't yet read, but it was, and you can see that I've just got a picture of the cover because I don't have the book yet. It's on its way, and I'll report back to you about it when I've read it. It's called Translucent Tree, and sorry, this is not the best printout, by Nobuko Tagaji, who is a Japanese author. And this book was recommended to me by Ronan Hessian, who wrote the fantastic Leonard and Hungry Paul, a book which I read last year and deeply loved. It was one of my favourites of last year. And I described it as a quiet book in one of the sessions I did last year about quiet literature. But anyway, Ronan Hessian recommended this book, Translucent Tree, which is all about a divorced single mother who's returned to Tsurugi City with her 11-year-old daughter to care for her ailing father, who's a famous sword maker whose business has completely faltered. And it falls to Shigiri to keep the debt collectors at bay. Go Imai is a freelance documentary maker, and he's on a business trip from Tokyo and has decided to stop by this little town of Tsurugi, where he'd come to do a story on Tsurugi's father 25 years ago. Go reunites with Chigiri, and the two begin a love story of epic consequences. And Ronan Hessian was raving about this book and saying that it's a deeply passionate and wonderful love story in which their love lasts until death does them part. So that is a great recommendation. Thanks so much to Ronan for that. Sam is just mentioning my gorgeous earrings, which were made by her daughter, and there's a shop on Etsy where people can buy them called the Ruby Heart Shop, and I absolutely love them, as you can see, and I feel that they go really well with my swan collar. Facebook people might not be seeing it all that well. Swans, of course, representing long-term love in life and literature. And swans were on my and my husband's wedding invitation 20 years ago. So we're doing well. Now I'm going to tell you about Alain de Botton's The Course of Love, which is a rather wonderful book all about a very realistic marriage. And I'd just like to mention, before going into that one, his first novel, Essays in Love, which he wrote back in 1993. And this is also a wonderful book about love. He is brilliant, I have to say, as someone who can dissect emotions in incredible detail and grow into great depth about the way one feels on a first date, for instance. And that book, Essays in Love, was a phenomenally incisive and intriguing book about the beginning of love, really, a first love story. And it talked about two young people meeting on an aeroplane, falling rapidly in love. And it's about the first few years of their relationship. However, The Course of Love, which was published about 5 years ago, is in a way a return to a more mature love story, which is all about what happens after the happily ever after. So what happens after the wedding bells and once the couples got together. And Alain de Botton takes a very ordinary couple, Rabbi and Kirsten, who are going through all the tedious, boring events that married couples have to go through, from going to IKEA to dealing with putting furniture together to going through just the tedium and boredom of married life. But it is very much a love story nonetheless. It's a story that probes the very heart of marriage, its shifts and squalls and its great adventures with forensic tenderness, says Deborah Magach, author of The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel. She loved it too. Alain de Botton is one of our great thinkers on modern life and the human condition. And this book is one which really reflects back at you what so many people feel in a modern marriage. There's all the messy, hilarious, painful, unromantic realism of the events of the modern world that make up a life shared between two people. It's very moving and deeply insightful, and it really opens up a window into truths about the nature of love. And it is one that you will laugh and probably cry in recognition as you read, even if you haven't fallen into the various pitfalls that they fall into in this book. I'll just give you a few quotes from the book, because it is one of those books which is full of wonderful, quotable moments. Love is a skill, not an enthusiasm, he says. That's a good one. To see love as a skill. I think everyone who has been in a relationship for a long time will realize that it is a skill to keep it all together. We should add that it is a privilege to be the recipient of a sulk. It means the other person respects and trusts us enough to think we should understand their unspoken hurt. It's one of the odder gifts of love, eventually. So that's quite a lovely idea to think that being the recipient of a sulk is a kind of gift. So next time that your partner is in a sulk, see it as a gift if you can. The partner truly best suited to us is not the one who miraculously happens to share every taste, but the one who can negotiate differences in taste with intelligence and grace. We don't need to be constantly reasonable in order to have good relationships. All we need to have mastered is the occasional capacity to acknowledge with good grace that we may, in one or two areas, be somewhat insane. That's a good quote as well. I think if you can acknowledge that both you and your partner in some ways are somewhat insane, then you're going to last a lot longer. His one last quote from Alain de Botton before we move on. In an ideal world, marriage vows would be entirely rewritten. At the altar, a couple would speak thus: "We accept not to panic when, some years from now, what we are doing today will seem like the worst decision of our lives. Yet, we promise not to look around either, for we accept that there cannot be better options out there. Everyone is always impossible. We are a demented species." He obviously does like to think about the madness of everyday life. And I think anyone that's listened to Alain de Botton on some of his talks from the School of Life will agree that he's a brilliant speaker and he can really talk about absolutely anything and make it sound interesting. And he does that in his writing as well as in his talks. So that's The Course of Love, which I would highly recommend to everyone to read. Now, another book which I don't have the physical copy of, but I've got it on Kindle, is a great book called Hide by Matthew Griffin, which was written in 2016, which is all about a gay relationship. And it starts off with two men, Wendell and Frank, who have been living together for many, many years, probably about 50 years, and they're now in their 80s, and they're just beginning to be rather old and frail. And what I love about this book, which depicts long-term love in a different way, is that these two men have lived together for decades, and we don't normally see gay relationships in literature which are so long lasting. Unfortunately, many gay relationships in literature end in sadness or death, possibly AIDS being a factor, or homophobia. But this book is called Hide because the two men do have to hide their relationship from the world. And it's all about how Frank and Wendell, who meet when they return home from the Second World War, and they get together, they fall for each other, and we see their relationship in flashbacks from this moment when they're together in their 80s. And we slowly realize as the book goes on that they have had to, in a way, remove themselves from society in order to survive, which is why it's called Hide, because they live on the outskirts of town. And one of them is a taxidermist. And being a taxidermist is actually quite a great way to stay away from society, because a lot of people are slightly horrified by the idea of stuffing animals. So if you wanted a profession that's going to keep you out of the eyes of most of society, being a taxidermist is a good one. So the novel begins with the two men having entered old age, and Wendell has aged better than Frank, who's had a minor stroke. And the stroke is what gets the plot going of the novel, because they realise slowly that their way of life, which they've been very carefully keeping up over the years, is now at threat, because they're going to have to probably bring in people from the outside to help them to live because they are old. And these books about old age are really touching and moving, and all the more moving, I feel, when it is a gay relationship, which isn't so frequently touched on in literature. And the book has a great power and beauty because of its small moments and observations. The way that Wendell and Frank divide the household chores is a charming and telling example of why it's such a lovely book. Wendell cooks. Frank has always been good at doing the household chores, but slowly their abilities to do both of those things are being eroded. And this is what makes it both a tragic and a deeply moving read. So it does have sad and cruel moments within the book because we do encounter homophobia from the outside, but it's a deeply sensitive, loving, compassionate tale. And I've got a couple of quotes from the author writing about the book because I saw him interviewed online talking about the impetus for writing the book, which is really great to hear. So the author says, it's about being about an older couple was the original impetus behind the novel. He says, I was quite close to both sets of my grandparents, and I saw them at the end of their lives, struggling to take care of each other as their mental and physical health declined. It seemed like just the most tragic thing, the way you can sacrifice and compromise in order to build a life around this one beautiful person, against all the odds that life throws at you, only inevitably, in the end, to lose them. From there, I started thinking about what it would have been like to have done the same things as a gay person in the 20th century, with all the added dangers and sacrifices that would have entailed. It seemed like a story I hadn't read before and one that felt important to tell. And I have to agree that it is an important story to tell, both in gay society, but actually also in heterosexual society, that we don't often see books about the latter end of life, particularly with couples caring for each other. There is a lovely book that I have also mentioned previously, which is Our Souls at Night by Kent Hanoof, which is all about an elderly couple who have known each other a little bit as neighbours, but slightly unexpectedly get together in their 70s. And it's a really beautiful, romantic, wonderful story, but also with tragic overtones too. So, authors out there, we would all love more books about older couples and about couples who are hanging in there, still being in love after all these years. The taxidermy element of the book, Hide, is also a really great element of the book because there's quite a lot of detail about it, just as an aside. And it's one of those subjects which you also don't see that frequently in literature, but it has a lot of great metaphors and people going into different just getting distracted by some of the comments there, sorry. People going into different directions due to their professions. So another book that I would love to mention, which talks about long-term love and relationships, and don't forget that I would love to hear your thoughts about such books if you have any favourite fiction with long-term lovers. So I don't just mean people that have loved each other for a short time. It's got to be more than 10 years, I say. Ideally, it ought to be several decades, at least 4 or 5 decades. So There's another great book called A Happy Marriage by Rafael Iglesias, which is candid and revelatory. And Rafael Iglesias is a screenwriter who has returned to fiction after a long hiatus. He wrote lots of books in the 1970s, and then this book, A Happy Marriage, was published in 2000, I think. And this book is the story of Enrique Sabas and his wife Margaret. It's the story of their love from start to finish over several decades. It alternates between the first 3 weeks of their acquaintance and the bittersweet final weeks of Margaret's life as she says goodbye to her family, friends, and children because she's dying of cancer. So, this is a book which is another one that's painful and sad to read, but it is beautiful, heartbreaking, and provocative. It's brutally honest in terms of talking about long term love, illness, and bereavement, but it's highly relatable, rather like the Alain de Botton Course of Love, probably a bit more of a serious and heavy book than that one, but it does have the euphoria of the first dates of the couple and then some of the everyday life of the couple as they lived through their decades of marriage, and then finally the last few months of their marriage, which is deeply sad. So that's another one which I would say is a great read, and it's called A Happy Marriage. Now, a book that was frequently mentioned by people when I put this idea into the ether, which seems to be one of the most popular romantic novels all about long-term love that I know, is The Time Traveller's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger. And this is indeed a wonderfully romantic and rather fabulous read, which, if you're one of the few people out there that hasn't read it, I would hugely recommend it. It has sold millions of copies. It was a Richard and Judy book club choice. It was huge in the States and in England, and there's also now been a film about it. The book is, of course, better, and it is a really fab read, which tells a story from the alternating perspectives of the two main protagonists, who are Henry and Claire. And Henry has a rare genetic disorder which comes to be known later in the book as chrono impairment. And this disorder causes Henry to involuntarily travel through time. And it causes huge complications both in his life and in the lives of anyone that he meets. And this is what makes it such a great romantic and also tragic book, because Henry knows he wants to be with Claire, his wife, but every now and then he accidentally travels in time to somewhere completely unexpected and unpredictable, and he can't do anything about it. So he might be in the middle of a highly important moment in his life when he suddenly disappears into a completely different era, and he might even come to harm in the places that he goes. So at one point he actually goes to Arctic temperatures and comes back with hideous frostbite and chilblains, which do permanent damage to him. So it is actually a fantastic and unexpected and odd book. But one of the most challenging and interesting aspects of the book also is trying to get pregnant. So Henry and Claire really want to have children, but because Henry has the genes for this genetic disorder, then the fetus also has a propensity to time travel. So the first few times when they first get pregnant, the fetus travels out of the womb and therefore dies. And this is deeply traumatic, and it is a really traumatizing book in terms of miscarriage. However, they do actually find a way in the end to help the fetus stay in one place, and they do manage to have a baby. And it's actually partly because they have a child that Henry discovers that he is going to die at a particular point in his daughter's life. And this is what makes it also an incredibly sad book, really rather devastating. And all the people I know that read it and talk about it are deeply moved by what happens at the end of the book without giving too much away. But it is a really good read, and it is a book which is very much really about the forbearance of Claire, who has to wait for Henry constantly. She's always waiting and never quite knowing when he's going to come back. And I'm going to read you a little quote about that, because a lot of people, men and women, have experienced that frustration of waiting. And some critics have said that the time travel element, in a way, is an elaborate metaphor for the frequently sexist situation where the women tend to be waiting for the men, and the men's lives seem to be frequently happening elsewhere, while the woman's life is frequently happening at home. Henry's been gone for almost 24 hours now, and as usual, I'm torn between thinking obsessively about when and where he might be, and being pissed at him for not being here. I hear Henry whistling as he comes up the path through the garden into the studio. He stomps the snow off his boots and shrugs off his coat. He's looking marvellous, really happy. My heart is racing, and I take a wild guess. May the 24th, 1989? Yes, oh yes! Henry scoops me up and swings me around. Now I'm laughing. We're both laughing. The date that she's referring to is the date that they first got together, May the 24th, 1989. And so it's a very romantic moment in their life. But that moment also reveals how frustrating and difficult life is for Claire, because she is always waiting for Henry to come back. So that's a novel which isn't necessarily a realistic inspiration for people to think about how to apply a couple's romantic life to their own. But it is a really gorgeous book to read, and it's one that inspires you to believe in love and to believe in the longevity of love, because Claire is waiting for Henry until she's in her 80s, and she's still seeing him when she's in her 80s, but at unpredictable moments. That's the both the joy and the tragedy of the book. So another gorgeous, lovely book that I am pretty much in love with about long-term love is Mr. Loverman by Bernardine Evaristo, winner of the Booker Prize for her book Girl, Woman, Other, which she shared the prize with Margaret Atwood. And Mr. Loverman is a book which I really hugely enjoyed. It's written in the voice of a man who comes from Antigua. He's called Barrington Jedediah Walker. He's 74 and he leads a double life. He was born and bred in Antigua, and he's lived in Hackney, London, since the 60s. He's a flamboyant, wise-cracking local character with a dapper taste in retro suits. I'm sorry, I don't have the book to hand, but there's a great picture of him on the cover looking really cool, wearing a really fantastic dapper suit. He's a husband, father, and grandfather, but he's also secretly homosexual, and he is lovers with his great childhood friend, Morris. His deeply religious and disappointed wife, Carmel, thinks that he sleeps with other women. She has no idea about his true nature, and we, the readers, have known about his true nature since pretty much the beginning of the book, because even when he's in Antigua, he is the lover of Morris. And that's what's so gorgeous about this book, is that he is Morris's lover throughout his entire life. And although he has huge complications in his life, in that he has to keep his love a secret and he's secretly gay, it is actually a positive and very loving portrayal of a gay relationship. And without giving too much away, he doesn't have to stay in the closet forever. Mr. Loverman is a portrayal of a late bloomer and his infectious zest for life, language, and love. He is in his 70s, but he's utterly full of energy, zest, and he has a fantastic sense of humour. And if you did get a chance to listen to this as an audiobook, it's a really great audiobook because you get the gorgeous Antiguan accent coming through. And it's a really wonderful listen, and it completely keeps you on the edge of your seat because you're desperate for him and Morris to get together, basically. I've got a little bit of a quote from the book to give you a flavour of it. I'm not going to try the Antiguan accent because I know I won't do it well. God damn me the day I chose to enter this hellish so-called marriage instead of following my Morris-loving, sweet-loving, full-blooded, hot-blooded, pumping, rumping, throbbing organ of an uncontainable, unrestrainable, undetainable, man-loving heart. And another little quote. In that moment, I wanted to tell this stranger, this Merle, this girl from the tiny island of Montserrat, that I had commensurate preferences too, but I couldn't be a brave warrior like her. I wanted to tell her about Morris. I wanted to sing his name out into the night. His name is Morris. He is my Morris, and he always has been my Morris. He's a good-hearted man, a special man, a sexy man, a history-loving man, a loyal man, a man who appreciates a good joke, a man of many moods, a drinking man, and a man with whom I can be myself completely. Yes, I was in the throes of a Malibu and coke-soaked madness, a madness that could lead to the demise of my life, as I'd hitherto known it. But I was on the verge. I love that book. It's so passionate and so energizing, and I would thoroughly recommend it as a great read or a great listen. Another book that came up as a recommendation to me when I was asking people for their suggestions was an unexpected long-term love novel, Butterfly Lion by Michael Morpurgo, which is about the love between a boy who becomes a man and a lion. And this was recommended to me by David and Estelle, who are frequent visitors to these sessions. And thanks so much for that recommendation. And it is indeed a really gorgeous novel about a boy who grows up in South Africa on a farm in the middle of nowhere. He's very lonely. And one day when his father shoots a family of lions, there's one little lion cub left. And the boy, Bertie, goes and rescues that little lion cub and manages to bring it home eventually after a few dramas and look after it. And they grow up as best of friends. And it's a really heartwarming, wonderful read. But being Michael Morpurgo, it's not a straightforward love story at all. The boy gets sent off to boarding school, then he goes off to war, he's sent off to the First World War, and he becomes a hero. He has all kinds of adventures, but all this time he's missing his lion, who he had sworn eternal allegiance to. So he is deeply heartbroken when he had to leave the lion, and he naturally decides that he must find the lion when he comes back home from the war. So off he goes in search, and he hears of a mythical white lion who was sold to a circus in France. And he does indeed track down his lion. And by this time, he's a grown man, and he also has a girl who comes into his life. And together they bring back the lion, who's called the White Prince, to their house in England. It's all sounding maybe a bit unrealistic, but I was completely there reading that book. It is a really inspiring and wonderful love story of long-term love of a different nature. So it's one that I would also really recommend as something different. So not just about human love, we can have long-lasting love of different kinds. And I know that there's going to be lots of books that people would probably recommend about the love of pets, of dogs, of cats. But I must say, this one about the boy and the lion is particularly fabulous. Another couple of long-term loves to mention are the grandparents in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which are examples of really gorgeous, inspiring lovers, because they share a bed with each other and with the whole family over many, many years. And children's books with long-term love are always inspiring and great reads. I'm just going to have a little sip of my orange juice while I ponder other long-term loves. There's also, in Harry Potter, Nicholas Flamel, who was, I think he died when he was about 660. Harry Potter experts might shoot me down, but he definitely lived for more than 600 years. And he died in very close proximity to his wife, who was just as ancient, and they had loved each other over the many, many years very deeply. And I think he died first and she died shortly afterwards of a broken heart. Anna is mentioning Light Years by James Salter, which is another book with a great long-term relationship. James Salter is a really fabulous, fabulous novelist too. So thanks for that recommendation. And I'm going to stop now on that lovely note. But I will post all my recommendations as an Instagram post and a Facebook post as a full list, so that you can look up which of those books you might like to read. And I'd love to hear of any others that you want to recommend, because I know there's lots of long-term loves lurking in fiction of all kinds. Another one that came to mind actually is Tom's Midnight Garden by Philippa Pierce, which is another long-time love about a boy who keeps going back to see the girl that he fell in love with. It's another time travel story as well. It's obviously a bit of a theme with long-term love in literature. And it's an incredibly romantic book, another great one to escape into. But I don't know if it totally qualifies properly for this theme, because I think the long-term love that's most inspiring to couples who are together and have been together for decades should be books that describe relationships with people who have actually lived together successfully for many years. So Love in the Time of Cholera is another one, which is possibly not totally qualifying, even though it's a highly romantic and gorgeous book. But it's one in which the protagonists are separated from youth because her parents deemed him an unsuitable suitor, and they only get together at the very end of the book after decades of separation. And it does make it a hugely romantic and inspiring book, helping you to believe in passion in your 70s or 80s. But it's also one which isn't really about the realistic side of love. So I would say that for the more realistic types of books looking at long-term love, The Course of Love by Alain de Botton is probably one of the best and one of the most inspiring. And also Hyde by Matthew Griffin, which I was talking about earlier, which is the one about the two men who've lived together successfully for 50 years, but have had to keep themselves hidden from society. That's also one of the most inspiring. I haven't managed to find any long-term lesbian love in literature. So tell me if you know of any. There's Tove Jansson and her partner, who were real gay lovers who did succeed in sticking together very successfully for many decades. And Tove Jansson does write about that in her short stories and also in her other writing. There's a few other books, such as Patricia Highsmith's The Price of Salt, which is a fantastic book about a happy gay relationship. In the end, it is successful. But that book ends when they've only really just got together in their 30s. It doesn't tell you what happens decades later. There is actually Annie on My Mind by Nancy Gardner, in which there's an older lesbian couple who clearly have successfully lived together for many years, but they're only in their 50s, which frankly isn't old enough. So if anyone knows of any older lovers in literature, particularly gay lovers and lesbian lovers, I'd love to hear from you. Do send me a message or send me a text or send me a tweet. So thanks so much for joining me this evening. I will be back next week on a mystery theme yet to be decided. Do tell me if you have any themes that you would like me to touch on soon. I'm going to be doing grandparents in literature in the near future. And if anyone else has any other themes that you'd like me to explore in literature, please let me know. Thank you for coming, everyone, and see you next week.